Today, for our second week of the spring quarter CDM research colloquium, we have Dr. Julian Brinkley. Dr. Julian Brinkley is an assistant professor of human-centered computing at Clemson University and the director of the design and research of in-vehicle experiences lab, or the Drive Lab. His research is focused on the intersection between user experience, highly and fully automated vehicles, and accessibility, work that is currently supported by grants from the National Science Foundation and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Beyond automotive research, he also explores how technology broadly may be leveraged for the social good, public safety, and entertainment. Dr. Brinkley completed a PhD in human-centered computing at the University of Florida. He holds an MS from East Carolina University in software engineering and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. So I will turn it over to Dr. Julian Brinkley, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So thank you for having me, Dr. Harrington. I really appreciate it. Obviously, due to COVID and other realities, it's not possible to be there physically, which would have been great, but I'm here virtually. So hopefully you all get something out of the talk that I'm prepared to give. So a little bit of background, and definitely thank you for the introduction. I am the lab director for the design and research of in-vehicle experiences lab at Clemson University. So we are a research lab that's a little bit different than the other labs located in the School of Computing at Clemson. We're actually located on the automotive engineering campus, which is in Greenville. In terms of the type of research that we conduct, we explore a lot of topics related to transportation accessibility, specifically for persons who are visually impaired and older adults. We also look at virtual reality, education, online social networks, a number of topics as it relates to those issues. And we also look at how to broadly use technology to solve societal problems, like accessible voting and things of that nature. Some of the type of work that we do, some of our more recent studies, we have an ongoing study. We do have a driving simulator with a motion platform that is looking at to what extent does the perceived age of a computer-generated voice reorient a distracted driver to the driving task in a level 3 partially automated vehicle. Also, to what extent does the assertiveness of the voice that attempts to reorient impact reorientation time? So the degree to which someone can effectively drive the vehicle after they've been engaged in a secondary task. We also have some ongoing research that is looking at ride-sharing technologies. We'll touch on the importance of ride-sharing technologies within the context of the larger picture of autonomous vehicle use, but specifically looking at ride-sharing technology accessibility and what the experience for persons with disabilities essentially is with many of these ride-sharing technologies. But today's talk will specifically focus on autonomous vehicle accessibility. That work specifically takes up the majority of my time. That's the majority of what we work on. 3 out of our 4 ongoing grants are focused on autonomous vehicle accessibility specifically. All of our current funding is focused on autonomous vehicles, but 3 of the 4 grants are focused on autonomous vehicle accessibility. So we're going to talk about some of the motivations for the research, focus groups that we've conducted, surveys, some of the participatory design methods that we've used up to this point, prototypes that we have developed, and we'll talk some about some of the implications of some of the prototype work that we've done, and then contributions and conclusions. Hopefully you all have plenty of questions. I'm going to ask that you give me an opportunity to address those questions at the end, but it would be helpful if you could, if you're thinking about them and you want to do so, you can just drop them in the chat. If I can work them into the discussion, I'll do so. Otherwise, I'll just address them towards the end. So let's get started. Autonomous vehicles. I don't know, obviously talking to different audiences, the awareness of all the different initiatives and related technologies that are emerging out of the autonomous vehicle developments. Not everyone is always clear on a lot of these advances. But generally speaking, people have, researchers, the media, industry have talked about the fact that emerging autonomous vehicles will potentially lead to reimagined cities. People will no longer necessarily have to drive into a city. There'll be fleets of autonomous vehicles that will basically ferry people to and fro. There's also the discussion about reduce pollution as a result of minimizing the number of vehicles on the road. If we're all sharing fleets of autonomous vehicles, it really minimizes the need to have, you know, millions of personal vehicles. One of the really significant implications is on health and personal safety. When we think about conventional vehicles, you know, one of the big concerns with the conventional vehicle is the frequency of motor vehicle crashes. Those crashes lead to significant losses of life, millions, if not billions of dollars of losses in property, so on and so forth. So the autonomous vehicle can really change the landscape of personal mobility from a variety of different perspectives. For persons with disabilities, however, the autonomous vehicle is really, you know, a multifaceted potential solution, and also something that presents a number of different challenges. Persons with disabilities and older adults are often severely impacted by issues of personal mobility. And these issues really impact employment, the ability to take advantage of educational opportunities, so on and so forth. Not to even, you know, get into what it looks like from the perspective of quality of life. So you think about it from the perspective of someone who's unable to operate a conventional motor vehicle. It really impacts where you live, where you shop, who you socialize with. There are a number of different things that these challenges with personal mobility really impact. In the US, you are twice as likely to be poor if you're disabled. And while we don't want to overgeneralize, a lot of these issues are related to mobility, personal mobility, and an inability to operate a conventional motor vehicle. And I would encourage you, if you have not read it already, to read the Rudderman white paper on autonomous vehicle accessibility and the impact of autonomous vehicles on persons with disabilities. One of the potential solutions, perhaps the key solution to address this problem of personal mobility for persons with disabilities, is the accessible autonomous vehicle. So when we think about autonomous vehicles, they are there are multiple levels of vehicular automation. The most advanced of these vehicles are referred to as level 5, SAE level 5, fully automated vehicles, wherein the operator, I prefer the term operator as opposed to a user, will have to do very little. Essentially, the only thing the operator really needs to do is specify a series of destinations or a final destination. So for someone who is unable to operate or manipulate the manual controls of a conventional vehicle, the accessible autonomous vehicle may be life-changing. The challenge, however, is that much of the recent literature, many comments from many advocacy organizations for persons with disabilities suggest that much of this technology is being designed in a manner that will render it largely inaccessible for persons with a variety of different disabilities. And when we think about this concept, we can think about a number of other technologies, the web being a prime example, that were largely designed. The web is a largely visual technology and medium. And it's only relatively recently that there have been attempts to basically retrofit this technology to be accessible for persons with visual disabilities. Many advocacy organizations and people within the community are concerned that the autonomous vehicle is being designed in a similar manner, in a way that will render it largely inaccessible to many people with disabilities. There have been recent initiatives for autonomous vehicle accessibility. So the government, industry, many people are starting to take notice of the reality that, we have a problem potentially here, that we have a technology that could disproportionately benefit persons with disabilities who can't operate a conventional motor vehicle, but there are significant concerns that it's being designed in a manner that's inaccessible. So the federal government has started to step in, chiefly through the Department of Transportation, and they have put forth a number of different initiatives. The two primary ones being the Department of Transportation's Inclusive Design Challenge, which I'll talk about a bit later, and the Accessible Transportation Technologies Research Initiative. The goals of both programs being to support the design of accessible autonomous vehicle technologies. So the goals of our research have largely been to investigate the needs of visually impaired persons and older adults specifically as it pertains to autonomous vehicles. We specifically focus on visually impaired persons and older adults, and by older adults, I mean persons 65 and above, primarily due to the fact that we are approaching this problem from the perspective of people who have challenges generally operating conventional motor vehicles. Again, driving being a task that is really visually oriented in many respects, requires the manipulation of a vehicle's manual controls, steering apparatus, braking, etc. We really wanted to approach this problem from the perspective of two groups that we feel have had some significant challenges that haven't necessarily been addressed in a conventional driving sense. Further, there has been an initiative within the National Federation of the Blind called the Blind Driver Initiative to design technologies to support the ability of a visually impaired driver to operate a conventional vehicle. So that gave us a bit of a platform to begin our work. So we wanted to start with some need finding activities. So we began with focus groups. Before we jump into that, I'm going to give a little bit of background on visual impairment and blindness. But we did focus groups both with visually impaired participants as well as with a few groups of older adults. But basically, visual impairment refers to vision loss that's not correctable by conventional means, that being glasses, contact lenses, some other conventional means. Some definitions also refer to vision loss not correctable by surgery as well. In terms of the more severe forms of visual impairment, there are roughly, and the numbers on this are somewhat difficult to come by simply because many of the people with the uncorrected or the with the type of vision loss we're talking about live in the developing world where oftentimes we don't have good data on the topic. But there are almost 8 million people in the United States who self-report as having a visual disability. And generally, when we talk about things like blindness, we have technical definitions, legal definitions of blindness, and then we have functional definitions of blindness and low vision. A lot of that is out of the scope of the current talk. So let's just, and I'm happy to answer questions about that once we conclude. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, the type of individual we are referring to as a visually impaired person is going to be someone who faces significant challenges, perhaps in a functional sense, using their visual senses. So in the focus groups we conducted 8 focus groups in North Central Florida with 38 participants. 22 self-identified as blind, and 16 as low vision based on a provided functional definition. And again, just to talk about that really briefly, legal blindness in the United States is referred to as vision loss in the better vision in the better seeing eye with conventional correction, that being glasses or contact lenses, of about 20/200 based on the scales. And we'll talk about that a little bit later if you have questions about that. But in those focus groups, we conducted 1-hour focus groups that followed a really traditional process. There was nothing really earth-shattering about the process we followed within those focus groups. Consent, introduction, ice-breaking exercise. Following those focus groups, we conducted a post-focus group interview with participants to determine if they, or really to ask further questions to see if they had things that they wanted to bring up within the focus groups and perhaps were uncomfortable about, or after reflection, if they had different, some different ideas that they wanted to provide some additional insight on. In terms of the major themes, we followed a traditional analysis process of the transcribed focus groups, covering things like, and the major themes which we identified were concerns, potential benefits of the technology, licensing and training, the human-machine interface, purchase considerations, and risk and trust. I think it's important to note that the concerns really outpace many of the other themes. And we'll talk about that momentarily. But generally, there was a more positive view of the technology than in other studies. So if you look at many, and I would say this is more common in much of the earlier research on self-driving or autonomous vehicles, there are people talk about the benefits of the technology, but they also voice many concerns. While there were a number of concerns raised within our research, overall, the view of the technology was much more positive than what I would say really is expressed in much of the other research. There was less concern about liability than what has been expressed in many of the other studies that have been conducted on this topic. Concerns were largely related to visual impairment. So there was a general sense that, or a general sentiment of, would I be blamed if my autonomous vehicle or self-driving vehicle were to be in an accident due to the fact that I am a visually impaired person? So would I automatically be viewed, would people automatically assume that I am somehow at fault, even though I'm not directly operating, I'm not directly manipulating the controls of the vehicle? There was a greater willingness to pay for the technology than in other studies. One of the big discussion points in the visually impaired community around autonomous vehicles is the question about whether or not a driver's license will be required to actually operate one of these vehicles. So there's been a lot of concern about that. Just from a logical, standpoint, if I'm a visually impaired person and I'm unable to get a conventional motor vehicle and I have this potentially life-changing technology, that requires that creates a barrier to my use of that technology where really none should exist. The general consensus of the groups was that some form of operator's license would be an acceptable compromise, viewed from the perspective of we probably want to ensure that there is some degree of training, but we don't think it's important necessarily to have a full-fledged driver's license to operate an autonomous vehicle. There were a lot of concerns about the human-machine interface, and there were many significant differences between what blind participants really were looking for with the HMI and what low vision participants were looking for. So many participants really gravitated towards the concept of some type of talking touchscreen or smartphone interaction. Younger participants were most emphatic about their desire to use their personal smartphone in some way, shape, or form to basically interact with the autonomous vehicle. But most of the literature basically indicates, and most of the literature generally not focused on visually impaired persons, indicates a preference for touchscreen interaction primarily, which an inaccessible touchscreen would basically serve as a de facto barrier of use for a visually impaired person. So moving on from this, and I'm going to, I'll skip this actually, just for the sake of time. One of the really critical questions from our perspective was whether or not visually impaired persons felt that their needs were being adequately considered in the development of the technology. As I mentioned earlier, the NFB and other advocacy organizations have suggested that the technology is being designed in a largely inaccessible manner. While opinions vary, most participants expressed the view that their needs were being largely ignored. So despite, many of the, Google has done some work with the visually impaired community, and they've touted the accessibility of their technology for visually impaired persons. But despite, some of these efforts and the publicity that it has generated, it was a general thought that their needs were being largely ignored. And you can read more about this study in the paper that is listed. So moving on from this, again, I indicated that we wanted to start by really focusing on visually impaired persons and older adults. There's a reality that people are actually living longer. They're living with a variety of different impairments and medical conditions that decades ago people just weren't living with. It's projected that in the US alone, there will be 74 million older adults by 2030. So when we look at the autonomous vehicle, the potential benefits of this technology are really similar, and there's a lot of overlap to what we would see with visually impaired persons in terms of improved personal mobility. But again, there hasn't been a lot of research that has looked at what the specific needs and preferences and concerns are of many older adults. So we wanted to conduct another series of focus groups just along the lines of what we conducted with our visually impaired participants. So we recruited 39 participants from senior centers in South Carolina. All were African American. We intentionally focused on African American older adults because this group particularly, we determined that their perspectives have been largely, if they exist in the literature, it's really hard to identify where to actually find that information. So we wanted to specifically identify the needs of African Americans. One of the factors involved in that decision is the reality that studies suggest that African Americans specifically cease driving at an earlier age than many other groups. So, the potential benefits of an autonomous vehicle are really significant for people within this group. Again, the concerns, when we look at the themes that were identified, the concerns regarding the technology really outpaced many other considerations. They were closely followed by purchase considerations, which in the paper that we published, we talk heavily about some of the financial, demographics of the group. So purchase considerations were heavily discussed, but really the concerns largely mirror to a great degree what we saw with the visually impaired participants of our focus groups. In terms of benefits, independence, mobility, similar to our visually impaired participants, were aspects that were heavily discussed. In terms of concerns, the ability to actually take control of the vehicle. Again, the majority of our older adult participants had driven previously in some capacity. So there was some desire to actually take control of the vehicle in the event of some sort of exigent circumstance, which largely mirrors what you see in the related literature. Much of the recent literature on autonomous vehicles suggests that people largely desire some means of taking control of the vehicle manually in the event that the vehicle gets into some sort of trouble, or there's some need to actually take control. But again, cost was a really significant factor that was discussed in terms of affordability, the ability to afford the vehicle itself, the ability to afford maintenance, repairs, and insurance. They were looked at as really significant concerns regarding concerns as it relates to a technology which many assume would be relatively expensive at the onset to begin with. With regard to risk and trust, there were expressed concerns about risk, trust, and vehicle safety. So the reliability of the technology, differing a bit from the visually impaired participants of the previous focus groups. Many in the older adult focus groups were really concerned about this prospect. Our visually impaired participants, many of them voiced a perspective that they don't drive themselves generally, so there's already an inherent risk, and many of them voiced a perspective that they actually felt safer having a machine driving than a human being. This was a little bit different for our older adults, many of whom, again, were or had been drivers, who were really concerned about vehicle safety and the operation of the vehicle. Legal and ethical concerns. There were some pretty significant concerns expressed about privacy and how much information that the vehicle itself would actually know about the occupants. So there were some concerns there. But again, the assumption in this regard for the majority of participants was that there would be some form of training provided and some form of licensure prior to operation of the vehicle. There were also concerns about the vehicle interacting with non-self-driving vehicles and interacting with pedestrians. Again, there were concerns expressed similarly from the visually impaired participants. But again, the concerns in this regard were primarily about non-self-driving vehicles operating on a road, on a roadway where machine-operated vehicles were present. And there was some concern there were some concerns raised about, even though these participants did not self-identify as visually impaired, there's some concerns about the technology in its design for the visually impaired and how it could potentially benefit them. So that was also not necessarily concerns, but comments raised about the potential benefits for people unable to operate conventional motor vehicles. And again, similar to visually impaired participants of the previous focus groups, the African-American participants in this series of focus groups didn't feel necessarily that the concerns of minorities generally were necessarily being considered, but they weren't necessarily entirely sure if the concerns that they expressed were necessarily different from what the concerns would be of their counterparts of other ethnicities. But that was something that was raised. And you can read more in a paper that we published in the proceedings of the 2019 Assets Conference. So moving on from that, we wanted to, obviously, continuing on with the need finding activity, we conducted the focus groups. Almost really closely following that, we decided to do some online surveys to get more of a broad-based perspective from the visually impaired community specifically about their needs, preferences, and concerns as it relates to autonomous vehicles. So the first survey we adapted relatively widely cited survey from Shuttle and CVAC, two researchers at the University of Michigan, which we revised to make more accessible. The initial survey was relatively inaccessible for visually impaired screen reader users specifically. So we reworked the survey to improve its accessibility. The questions generally explored perspectives on autonomous vehicles, the potential benefits of the technology, concerns, and specific issues related to visual impairment and blindness. So we had this data from the focus groups. We wanted to see if, once we asked these questions more broadly, would the perspectives generally be consistent, or would they differ in some capacity, or so on and so forth. But again, our findings largely mirrored what we found in the focus groups, but just with a bit more actual quantitative perspective. Again, generally positive view of the technology. On average, a greater willingness to pay for the technology, which is really significant when you think about what I discussed earlier, in that, you know, in the United States, if you're disabled, the likelihood that you are going to live below the poverty line is greater. So even factoring that in, there was a greater willingness to pay for the technology, which seemed to be related to the potential benefits that many respondents view that they would actually get from the technology in terms of independence and personal mobility. The ability to operate an autonomous vehicle was a significant concern of older adults in the survey. There was a preference for voice interaction capabilities by all groups, smartphone interaction by younger participants, so those 18 to 35. And again, there was a lot of concern about the human-machine interface, specifically things like situational awareness, location verification, the occupant passenger experience, and parking. And just to touch on that a little bit, we were talking about, I know I touched on very early on some of the work we're doing as it relates to ride sharing technologies. So the general thought is that many people will interact with autonomous vehicles initially through ride sharing services like autonomous Ubers, autonomous Lyfts, Waymo One, so on and so forth. So really, if we think about that type of ride sharing service augmented by autonomous vehicles, there are a number of significant challenges for older adults and visually impaired persons if the ride sharing service itself, even with the autonomous vehicle, is in some way inaccessible. So when we think about things like situational awareness, being aware of your surroundings, so on and so forth, and location verification. In a ride sharing scenario specifically, location verification is really critical. Because if we think about it, if you take a person who is blind with limited usable vision, it may be very difficult for them to non-visually verify that they have arrived at a desired destination when using an autonomous ride-sharing service. So that puts them in a position where if they get out of the vehicle, who's to say that the ride-sharing vehicle may not simply leave while having taken them to somewhere that they actually didn't want to go. So something that was brought up from multiple perspectives by many of our focus group and survey participants. And we've published a few papers on this topic. I've just listed two. One recent paper in T-Access from last year looks at looks at a lot of the data from both the focus groups and surveys that we collected in those need finding activities. Following that, and this is very recent, within the past 12 months, we have conducted two additional surveys. One, a larger survey distributed by the National Federation of the Blind and the American Council of the Blind, looking at user acceptance of autonomous vehicles. Then also a separate survey also distributed by the NFB. This one was about 4 months after the initial distribution of the autonomous vehicle acceptance survey that specifically looks at issues of ride sharing and personal safety. And our goal is to basically put all that data together and essentially see where there are commonalities, where there are differences, and what the perspectives are of visually impaired persons in a broader sense about autonomous vehicle and ride sharing technologies. So we did the need finding activity. So what we wanted to do following that process was to engage in a process of designing some prototypes intended primarily to address the human-machine interface concerns of the visually impaired persons and older adults who participated in our research. So we conducted some participatory design sessions, 16 one-hour sessions in groups of 4 to 5 participants. The groups were largely structured around the degree of vision loss. So the first group was low vision participants, 18 to 35. So this is really reflective of the different groupings we identified in our previous research. Blind participants in the 18 to 64 age group, and then people who self-identified as blind who are considered older adults or elderly, so 65 and above. We use personas really to assist participants in bringing in their own lived experiences as visually impaired persons without necessarily having them focus on their own needs, but instead collectively focusing on the needs of a persona. These personas were reviewed by, and personas are essentially characters for those of you not overly familiar with them. Essentially characters that were reviewed by community partners for believability. And we brought these characters into the participatory design process, and we asked each group to essentially design in a low fidelity manner human-machine interface and an interaction process for an autonomous vehicle, designed initially to be accessible. So we introduced personas through personal narratives that were actually voiced by professional voice actors. Again, the goal being to introduce characters in a very believable manner. And again, the goal was to help participants to think beyond their own needs in a collective design process while increasing engagement. And our personas, we wanted to make the personas realistic, but we also didn't want to be ableist in the sense that we were constructing characters with what could be argued are stereotypical type characteristics. So we identified 3 characters: a 24-year-old student with low vision, a 48-year-old reporter who self-identified as blind, and a 72-year-old blind retiree. And to the degree possible, we had visually impaired persons actually voice these characters. Because again, we don't just want to take from the community, we want to also give back and give opportunity as well. So we introduced the personas, we did a needs introduction, and then in the later sessions, we actually had participants, we introduced paper and higher fidelity prototypes, which were largely designed to run on a tablet computer into the participatory design process. In the final session, we basically took, and in between sessions, so we would do a design session, we would collect data, we would go back and we would actually design and develop, or would develop prototypes based on the design ideas of our visually impaired participants. In between the sessions, we would actually develop, and then in subsequent sessions, we would come back and introduce what we actually brought to life as a result of the information we gleaned from our participants. In terms of the design needs, they largely mirror, the design needs that were identified largely mirror what we found to a great degree in the focus groups. In terms of a desire to be situationally aware, so to know where you're going, how you're getting there, so on and so forth. Location verification, so how do I non-visually know that I have arrived at the appropriate location. The ability to specify destinations, and a lot of this has overlaps just with traditional mobility technologies that are used by many visually impaired persons. So this didn't differ to a great degree. So moving on from that, we wanted to do some additional research and design with older adults specifically, some with disabilities, some without. So we identified older adults 65 and above. We recruited 30 older adults to participate in an enactment process and focus groups. So basically, user enactment is a process. We didn't develop it, but it is a process that comes out of the concept of body storming and think aloud approaches to research, where people basically express themselves physically, and you basically analyze, that expressiveness to draw conclusions about the design of a technology. Generally, participants are presented with a specific scenario and they're asked to imagine future outcomes. So in our case, we did a pilot where we basically tried this process out. There really isn't a lot of data on using enactment with older adults. So we wanted to do a pilot to basically try out this approach to see if it was feasible. But basically what we did in a very low fidelity manner, we created an outline of a 3-row SUV. We used chairs to represent seats. And we asked our older adult participants to basically act out what they would do within an autonomous vehicle. So we gave them a series of scenarios and we asked them to basically act out the accessibility aspect of the interaction. So what that interaction would look like in that autonomous vehicle. So the participants were really enthusiastic about the process, and they came up with a number of really interesting suggestions to make the autonomous vehicle more accessible, from swivel seats to increase accessibility, to automatic doors, to assist those who are unable to actually open a door manually. Emergency assistance was something that they suggested. So this differed quite substantially from our African-American participants, many of whom were concerned about the amount of information that the autonomous vehicle would collect. In this specific case, these older adults in the enactment situation, the enactment scenarios, really wanted the vehicle to have a lot of information about them so that if they were in a position where they were in distress, the vehicle could take action of some sort, whether that be to take them to the hospital or some other manner. So we initially thought, or one of our initial theories was that many would view the shared autonomous vehicle. So again, in a ride sharing context, that is generally the scenario that we gave, that it could be an opportunity for social interaction. Really, the participants were resistant to that concept and simply viewed it as a means of getting from point A to point B. So there wasn't much social interaction or engagement within the scenarios. Now, we've talked about the need finding activities that we've engaged in. We've talked about the participatory design process that we use to develop prototypes. I intentionally have not gone into a lot of depth about what the prototypes look like, how people were interacting with them necessarily, and I'll explain why in a moment. But generally, we incorporated a number of different technologies. So we took all of this information and we wanted to basically develop some mid to high fidelity prototypes that we could actually put in a vehicle. So we used, to address the desire for speech interaction, we developed a mixed initiative voice user interface using a cloud-based language model. We incorporated facial recognition technology for system personalization. We used 3D audio to support situational awareness. We used computer vision to vocalize descriptions of the exterior, to do a form of exterior analysis. So let's say you're in an autonomous vehicle and it takes you to, what you think should be a grocery store. The system would vocalize a description of that exterior environment. So there are cars, there are people, so on and so forth, to a relatively significant degree of depth to provide some indication as to whether you have arrived at the appropriate location or not. Further, we didn't implement some of these aspects, the parking and return, but things like location search, destination specification, we implemented all of that in the prototypes that we developed. That led to the development of what we call the Atlas system, the accessible technology leveraged for autonomous vehicle system. So this is an accessible human-machine interface for an autonomous vehicle designed to address the accessibility and experiential needs of visually impaired users primarily, and older adults to a degree as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that the federal government has created a couple different initiatives to support the design of accessible autonomous vehicle technologies, that being the ATTRI and the Department of Transportation's Inclusive Design Challenge. The Inclusive Design Challenge is a $5 million, it's considered a grand challenge with a $5 million prize pool, 10 semi-finalists and 3 finalists, focused on innovative design solutions for autonomous vehicles. So we submitted an entry based on all of the information that we had gathered through the different processes and research that we had been engaged in. And we were actually selected as a semi-finalist for this challenge. So we were actually awarded a semi-finalist prize for the challenge, and we will be submitting, we are in the process of designing and developing Atlas 2, which we hope, keep your fingers crossed for us, that will end up as one of the 3 finalists. So that's the goal. So the reason why I'm not going into a lot of detail about what we specifically implemented from a prototype perspective is because this is going to be on YouTube, and I don't want to necessarily tell everybody what we're building. So, but hopefully you can understand that and have gotten something about what we have been talking about. But and to conclude, I really want to talk about how we have been going about the process of evaluating our prototypes, which I think is relatively interesting. So it would be great if we could take these prototypes and basically put them in an autonomous vehicle. Problem being, there are a number of safety concerns about trying to do so. There are a number of just practical concerns about trying to implement our HMI into an actual vehicle. Vehicle integration is a huge challenge, even in a production and industrial setting. So it's just something out of the scope of what we would be able to do. The simulator is great, but it doesn't necessarily replicate the real world in a way that is sufficient for what we want to do. So we borrowed a technique from Stanford, from Wendy Ju, who's currently at Cornell Tech, called RADS, the Railroad Autonomous Driving Simulation Process. It's basically a Wizard of Oz type approach where you're asked to imagine that you are in a self-driving vehicle. So a Wizard of Oz experiment is one where aspects of the system under evaluation are actually manipulated by an unseen human being, hence the Wizard of Oz type term. So with the RADS process, we basically put people in a conventional vehicle, which we configure to look like an autonomous vehicle. We basically hide the driver behind a physical partition, and we have a research team member seated in the rear of the vehicle with the participant who directly interacts with them as they interact with the system that we're actually evaluating. The goal is to create the illusion that they're actually in an autonomous vehicle without the safety concerns and the integration concerns of actually putting them in an autonomous vehicle. So in our RAD studies, we have up to this point used a 2018 Volkswagen SUV. We recently purchased another vehicle, which we're currently outfitting for the Inclusive Design Challenge with our design technology. But we basically have a physical partition. Go back. We basically have a physical partition where the human driver is basically obscured and sound is basically limited. The goal being to really create that impression that you're in an actual autonomous vehicle, provided that you buy into the whole process. And so this is an example of one of our early partitions. Basically using foam board, duct tape, and basically anything else we could get our hands on. We try to be creative because it's not easy to actually build a fixed partition within an existing vehicle, as I'm sure you can imagine. We mounted a tablet to the rear of the seat and added our other devices within the vehicle. But again, the driver was obscured behind an actual partition. But the vehicle was configured in such a way to where you wouldn't physically be able to see the person. And we had some padding within the partition to basically limit sound. We piloted this on an almost 4-mile road course in Ocala, Florida. And it was relatively effective. We published a paper, which I didn't list, on that evaluation process. I'd be happy to, if you want to reach out after, I'd be happy to share that, that paper with you as well. So to conclude, this research has contributed what are some of the first formal published studies of visually impaired consumers and older adults on self-driving or fully autonomous vehicles. We've also received a reasonable amount of press from some of these studies. It's been picked up by some news agencies. So our ongoing research is continuing to look at autonomous vehicle accessibility. We're also looking at level 3 autonomous vehicles and issues related to handover and takeover. So transitioning an inattentive driver who's been doing a secondary task like playing on the tablet or reading a book, reorienting them back into the driving task. And we're also looking at the accessible transportation chain, a concept developed by the Department of Transportation, which essentially looks at the process through which someone would use multiple transportation technologies like an autonomous shuttle, train, a bus, so on and so forth, to go from one location to a final destination. But thank you for listening. At this point, I am happy to take your questions, and I'm going to open up the chat. I think I'll leave it to you, Dr. Harrington. Would you prefer that I start with the questions in the chat or
so first, I just wanted to thank you for an amazing talk. I've been over here jotting down notes. We have to talk, and I'm definitely going to look up a number of your papers just because of the methodology and engaging Black older adults is some of the work that I do. And I think that there's a lot of crossover that I could learn from some of the things that you've published. But we have gotten a couple of comments and questions in the chat throughout the talk. I know that Victoria Lopez asked about the title of the white paper that you mentioned, and if you could state that again.
Yes, so it's the Rudderman Foundation. It's a white paper. I believe the title is Autonomous Vehicles and the Impact on Persons with Disabilities. If that's not exactly the title, it's close enough to where you should be able to find it.
Do you have another question, Victoria? Go ahead.
I do. Thank you. There you go. I know you briefly mentioned about how some of the research you were finding is that people were more comfortable with the autonomous vehicles, but did you also find that people still wanted to have connection to a human somehow, or were they just totally fine without any human driver or vehicle assister in the car whatsoever, and it was just them in this kind of silo?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. So we did a study. At this point, it's been about 2 years ago. We're doing some follow-up work on that now that we're currently designing, where we looked at really the processes through which a visually impaired person would become comfortable in a ride-sharing vehicle. So what we did was we call it more or less a quasi-naturalistic study because it's not purely, naturalistic. But what we did was we asked visually impaired persons to interact with, to use a ride-sharing service. They had cameras, we transcribed, the interaction with the driver, so on and so forth. And what we found there really was a lot that the human does within that ride-sharing context, which is what we anticipate, or how we anticipate people will initially encounter or interact with autonomous vehicles, is through those ride-sharing services. The driver really does a lot. The driver does a lot to make the passenger comfortable. The driver does a lot to actually support the ability to get in and out of the vehicle in a practical sense. We had several participants with motor impairments who needed assistance actually getting into the vehicle. So there was what we understood from that project, from that research. There was a strong desire for some form of human interaction within the ride sharing context. Now, whether or not that would continue to be true if we actually move to an autonomous ride sharing vehicle, it's not entirely clear. I think based on what we understand currently, and I think some of this, and I don't mean to be to go down the rabbit hole on your question, but I think your question really touches on a couple different things. When we look at services like ARIA, for those of you who are unfamiliar, if you're familiar with it, forgive me, I'm going to explain it a little bit. But ARIA, ARIA, is a service that is used by visually impaired persons where they are given a camera and they communicate with, they're considered explorers, and they communicate with sighted persons who basically provide directions and serve as their eyes, essentially. And explain, what is going on. They can be used to read a book or, provide a navigation assistance, so on and so forth. So when we look at those types of services and we look at the type of work that we've done up to this point and the information that we've gathered, it suggests that there probably is still going to need to be some form of, or there will be some desire for some form of human-like interaction. Now, whether that can be satisfied with some form of autonomous automated system, is kind of unclear.
Okay, so the next question that we have in the chat is from Juan, and I'll read this just so that everyone else can know what the basis of the question was. So autonomy of any system and assets requires an active exchange of data or information about the environment, such as natural environment, human interactions, real-time events, etc. In the case of autonomous vehicles, the amount of data transfers would be incredibly huge. So here's the question. In what step of this research are you considering information security and means of transfer, such as hacking, corrupted data transfers, and incompatibility with new technologies may adversely affect autonomous vehicles?
Okay, good question. So in our inclusive design challenge submission, we actually have a team. I lead the team, but we actually have a team that consists of myself and two other researchers in the automotive engineering department here at Clemson. Essentially what we have done up to this point, and those are very valid concerns. There are a number of implementation related concerns that many have brought up to this point. And all those concerns are valid. Some relate to things like the accuracy of GPS, for instance, and to what degree GPS will be suitably, or any kind of localization type technology will be suitably accurate to practically implement some of what we're designing. I want to answer your question by saying, in my role as a human-centered computing researcher, while I consider some of the challenges and barriers and some of the practical realities as it relates to implementation constraints, I don't get so hung up on that. Really what I focus on is trying to think about what that interaction should look like. What should that experience and interaction consist of? And then from there, we try to figure out how can we make that real. So if there are barriers, if there are technological hurdles that we need to overcome to make these things a practical reality, that's fine. But what we're specifically focused on is the concept and the ideas around what we want to implement. So we largely take the approach that if it's possible, we'll figure out how to actually implement it in some way. So your question is a very appropriate question. but we're not there yet in terms of implementation. The Inclusive Design Challenge project is for that reason, specifically focused on design. Right now, even the concepts around what the experience for a disabled or older adult user haven't really been solidified. So we're really so early in the process that thinking about some of these issues from an implementation perspective are a bit premature.
Okay. So the next question that we have is from Christian Martinez, asking, how does the vehicle obtain cues from the real environment in terms of dangerous situations and destination accuracy?
That again goes to more of the implementation, which again, we're not really focused on at this point. We're focused, now I can, let me answer that question this way. I can make certain, so we make certain assumptions in what we are actually designing in terms of, so we're not going to design something that says, you know, this vehicle is all knowing, it's going to have, you know, it's going to be, you know, 100% foolproof. It has the communication channel is always going to be, you know, 100% secure, or, you know, it's always going to have accurate information. We don't make those types of assumptions simply because that's a bit unrealistic. But setting that to the side, we also don't really get a lot into some of the challenges that we know, you know, will exist. Like we know that we're not going to have complete information. Like we know that. But we do, you know, take kind of creative license in some of the things we're doing from a design perspective. And I kind of turn it over to my automotive engineering colleagues to figure out, once we actually design what we want to build, to actually figure out how to implement that. So, you know, implementation is, again, you know, any type of implementation is going to be challenging. I think, and that really goes towards one of the other reasons why we're not attempting to put this in an actual vehicle up to this point. So we're really focused on figuring out the design. And my background, just to provide a little bit more information about that, I come from a software engineering background. So a lot of the ways that I have traditionally approached problems is to, you know, let's build something. So that's the way a lot of times that I tend to approach problems. In this specific case, taking that approach would be a little bit misplaced, I think, simply because, again, the concepts around what accessible interaction would look like for a person with a disability is really, you know, unclear up to this point.
Okay. We're going to try to get to a couple more questions before we wrap today. But I also just uploaded the YouTube channel because someone asked about being able to see the rest of the questions after they have to hop off. So our YouTube channel link is in the bottom of the chat. And the talks from this quarter should be uploaded within the next couple of weeks. I'm not in charge of that, so I don't know the exact date, but we will get them uploaded. I see we have a question from Chaudhry Shatab.
Yes, hi, this is Shatabdi.
Shatabdi.
Can you
Sorry
hear me?
about that. Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, so thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question is about one of the pointers discussed about risk, trust, security in the focus group study. Is the risk, trust, security, ethics, those topics are coming from the population who are, is it their perception of risk, trust, security in this kind of vehicle, autonomous vehicle, or is there a plan to like maybe educate this population about autonomous vehicle, or if there is issue with risk, trust, and security for the population, then what is your suggestion to improve it?
Very good question, and thank you for your question. I appreciate it. So I think what you'll find, and I found this, I tried to engage very heavily with the communities that we work with within this research. I'm a firm believer that, with these communities, one of the big things that you'll find in doing research, if you ever do any kind of accessibility research or work with, visually impaired persons, older adults, people with a variety of other disabilities, is that they don't want to just be given technologies and told to figure out how to use them, right?
Mhm.
And in many respects, they are very, very attuned and educated about the goings on with technologies that may potentially benefit them pretty substantially. So what I found in my research is that many visually impaired persons specifically are really very informed about autonomous vehicle technologies, more so than even people necessarily who are coming from a technical background. A lot of times they're very informed about the legal decisions, the legal landscape of autonomous vehicles, what manufacturers are currently developing autonomous vehicles. So I don't think their concerns regarding risk, trust, and safety are necessarily driven by a lack of education on the development of the technology, because really what I found is relative to many others, there is a relative acceptance of the risks inherent in using an autonomous vehicle. The general thinking from both the focus groups and the surveys was that this technology may be relatively risky at its outset. However, the potential benefits from the perspective of personal mobility and independence far outweigh the risks. And one of the quotes that I introduced during the talk was that, a few participants indicated that, they already, because they either use public transportation or rely on friends or family members for transportation, they already transfer control, in a sense, for their personal mobility to others anyway. The only difference in this context would be, instead of transferring that control to an arguably fallible human being, they're transferring control to an arguably less fallible machine.
Thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Damien. Regarding self-driving cars, are there any laws or regulations that the federal government can make to help people with disabilities? So for example, could the Americans with Disabilities Act be expanded to cover vehicles once fully autonomous vehicles are considered a typical form of transportation? Great question, Damien.
Well, thank you for the question. And my general thinking, and I have published a paper on this topic on policy guidance for autonomous vehicle accessibility in the Journal on Technology and Persons with Disabilities. And generally what I would say, to answer that question directly, is that it probably wouldn't help if the government were to put out some sort of, or if legislation was passed to mandate accessibility. And here's why I say that. If we look at other technologies, let's take the web as an example, or really any other technology that is whose accessibility is governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act or any other state or local legislation. The bar to make that technology, or really any technology, technically accessible to the point to where you won't get sued, or you can at least win a lawsuit or you won't be fined, or something else as it relates to some of this legislation. The bar is so low in most circumstances, which is why you've seen things like with social networking sites up until relatively recently, they were technically accessible, but not necessarily functionally usable. So the bar to be technically accessible is so relatively low that it's easy to kind of meet that standard. You can check a box and say, okay, this is technically accessible. You're technically meeting the requirements for accessibility, but it's still not something that's really usable in a practical sense by a person with a disability. So I think the better course of action in this case is really what the government is doing. They could do more of it, obviously, but I think what they're doing, they're trying to get buy-in from the manufacturers through these challenges and initiatives to get them to make their technologies usable by people with disabilities. If we think about this from, any of these businesses will largely view these problems to a great degree, unfortunately, from a monetary perspective. So how much money is it actually going to put in their pocket if they actually make this technology accessible? If they make it, are they going to make more money by making it accessible? Are they going to make less money if they don't make it accessible? What are the dollars and cents of the problem? So when we think about the reality that there are almost 8 million people who self-identify as being visually impaired, that's a lot of consumers. So if by creating initiatives that encourage the development of accessible autonomous vehicle technologies, and by reinforcing to manufacturers that it's in their financial best interest to make the technology accessible, I think that's a much better way to go than basically passing another law that they're probably just going to ignore anyway.
Okay. We're going to try to get in one more question. So I'll actually let it be presenters pick. Julian, we have like a couple. I don't know which one, the last thing you want to answer after Damien's question in the chat.
Let me see. I'm just going to pick one from the chat. Okay, well, this is one. Is the size of the vehicle important for the visually impaired participant? I think to a degree, and I'm basically answering that question because it gives me an opportunity to answer another question that's kind of related. So just bear with me. I think the size of the vehicle, the physical infrastructure of the vehicle, all of that is really going to make a difference. So we've done at this point probably 3 to 4 years of prototype development. I've done this with students in classes that I've taught. I've done this as standalone research projects. We've done a lot of prototyping and design work around accessible autonomous vehicles. So a lot of that work suggests that accessibility is more than just the actual HMI, the internal human-machine interface, that when you're thinking about an accessible autonomous vehicle, whether that be a ride-sharing vehicle or just a personal vehicle, we have things like the external human-machine interface, which is important that that is accessible. How do you make that accessible? If we think about eHMIs as being largely visual, how do you make that accessible for a visually impaired person to support their ability to navigate to the vehicle, for instance? We have the internal HMI, obviously, which we've been talking about and which we focused on in this research. And we also have things like the physical, the package design or infrastructure of the vehicle itself, that being seating, and other aspects of the physical vehicle. So some of the prototypes that we have developed have done things like smart armrests with tangible buttons, and so we've really covered a lot of ground in the different things that we have tried from the perspective of prototypes for these different vehicles. But I think the actual physical design of the vehicle does make a big difference. And it especially makes a difference when we're talking about people who may be visually impaired, but who may also have motor impairments, who may need greater support in a physical sense, may need vehicle securement technologies, for instance, to secure a wheelchair perhaps. So it does make a difference.
Okay. Well, we want to thank Dr. Brinkley so much for your time, for this amazing talk. A lot of folks, you know, have left comments and questions, and seems like there's a lot of interest in this work. Dr. Brinkley has left his email and his Twitter on the screen, so you can feel free to reach out to him. As I mentioned, this recording for those who are in the CDM Research Colloquium class will be uploaded to D2L, but will also be on the Research Colloquium's YouTube page for viewing afterwards, and hopefully you can find ways to connect with him or just learn from this talk for your own personal work. So I do want to thank you so much, Julian. This was amazing, and I appreciate you coming and doing this today. And thank all of you who attended.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.
All right, everyone have a great afternoon. And Julian, yeah, if you have any follow-up questions, let me know via email or, yeah.
Okay, let's connect soon. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.